The moment David opened his eyes, he knew something was catastrophically wrong. The sterile hum of his engineering lab had been replaced by the sound of bleating sheep and the acrid stench of manure. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. David's hands shot out, grasping for his workbench, his laptop, anything familiar. Instead, rough straw pricked his palms. He bolted upright, skull cracking against a low wooden beam. Stars exploded across his vision as he collapsed back onto what he now realized was a pile of hay in what appeared to be a barn. No, not just any barn, but one that looked like it had been lifted straight from a history textbook. No electric lights, no concrete, just rough-hewn timber held together with wooden pegs and crude iron nails. His breath came in ragged gasps. The lab. He'd been in the lab, working late on the new turbine design. The coffee had tasted strange, but he'd attributed it to the ancient machine in the break room. Then the dizziness hit, the world tilting sideways. And then, this. Voices drifted through the thin wooden walls, not English, or rather, a form of English so archaic it might as well have been a foreign language. David's engineering mind kicked in, compartmentalizing panic, analyzing data, medieval construction techniques, pre-industrial tooling marks, the complete absence of any modern materials or methods. Time travel was impossible. Every law of physics screamed against it. Yet here he sat, wearing his jeans and MIT sweatshirt in what looked disturbingly like the 14th century. The barn door creaked open. A young woman entered, carrying a wooden bucket. She took one look at David, his strange clothes, his clean-shaven face, his look of absolute terror, and screamed. The bucket clattered to the ground, milk spreading across the packed earth floor. "Wait!" David raised his hands, trying to look non-threatening. I don't, please!" But she was already gone, shouting in that barely recognizable dialect. Within minutes, half the village had surrounded the barn, men with pitchforks and crude farming implements, women clutching children behind their skirts, all staring at him like he was something that had crawled out of their worst nightmares. An older man pushed through the crowd. His bearing suggested authority. Better clothes, though still rough by modern standards, gray beard trimmed with actual care. He barked questions that David couldn't understand, growing more agitated with each non-response. David's mind raced. He needed to communicate, needed to show he wasn't a threat. He pointed to himself. "David, my name is David." Then gestured to his head, miming confusion. "Lost. I'm lost." The bearded man, clearly some sort of village elder, studied him with shrewd eyes. He spoke again, slower this time, and David caught familiar word roots buried in the archaic pronunciation. Something about where he came from, something about his purpose. "Boston," David tried, knowing it was useless. "America. But that doesn't exist yet, does it?" The crowd muttered. Several made signs against evil. The elder silenced them with a gesture, then pointed to David's sweatshirt. The MIT logo meant nothing to them, but the quality of the garment, the impossible evenness of the stitching, the synthetic materials, it all marked him as something other. They bound his hands, not cruelly, but efficiently. David didn't resist. Where would he run? To what? This village, wherever and whenever it was, might be his only chance at survival. They housed him in what he gradually understood was a storage room beneath the elder's home. Not quite a prison, but certainly not freedom. Food came twice a day, coarse bread, thin soup, occasionally a piece of cheese or dried meat. David forced himself to eat, though his stomach rebelled against the foreign bacteria and questionable preservation methods. Days blended together. David occupied himself by observing everything he could through the small, high window. The village was small, perhaps 200 people. Farming community, clearly, subsistence level. He watched them work the fields with tools that belonged in museums, watched them haul water from a central well, watched them struggle with tasks that basic mechanical advantage could simplify. The engineering problems accumulated in his mind. Inefficient plowing methods, water distribution that required constant manual labor, no mechanical power beyond the occasional ox or donkey. The windmill idea began as an idle thought, a mental exercise to stay sane. But the more he observed, the more it transformed into possibility. 3 weeks into his captivity, the elder visited personally. He brought a younger man, grandson, David guessed from the resemblance. The younger man had traveled, had some exposure to broader dialects. Communication was still fractured, but possible. "You say, you make things?" the young man translated haltingly. "Build things," David nodded eagerly. "Yes, engineer. I design machines." He mimed turning gears, mechanical motion. The elder asked sharp questions through his grandson. What kind of machines? For what purpose? Could David prove his claims? David requested charcoal and a flat piece of wood. When they arrived, he began sketching. Simple machines first: liver, wheel and axle, pulley, then more complex applications, a better plow design, a mechanical press, and finally, heart-pounding, a windmill. The elder studied the drawings with surprising comprehension. These people might lack modern technology, but they weren't stupid. They understood mechanical advantage when they saw it. "This," the elder pointed to the windmill sketch, speaking slowly enough for David to follow. "This catches wind, makes power?" "Yes," David confirmed, "for grinding grain, pumping water, many uses." The elder and grandson conferred, rapidly. David caught fragments, something about the failing harvest, the difficulty of grinding enough grain before spoilage, the distance to the Lord's mill where they paid crushing taxes for the privilege of making flour. Finally, the elder made a decision. Through the grandson, he laid out terms. David would build his wind machine. If it worked, he would be accepted into the village, given a place. If it failed, or if he attempted any sorcery, the consequences would be severe. David accepted immediately. What choice did he have? Besides, the engineering challenge sparked something in him that had been dormant since his arrival. Purpose, direction, a problem to solve. They gave him limited freedom, always watched but able to move about the village. David spent days observing wind patterns, identifying the best location. The hill overlooking the village was perfect. Consistent winds from the west, elevation to catch higher airstreams, solid ground for foundation. The real challenge was materials. No steel, no precision bearings, no manufactured lumber. Everything would have to be adapted from what existed. David filled scraps of parchment with calculations, converting modern engineering principles to medieval materials. Wood selection became critical. He needed strength, but also flexibility. The village carpenter, initially suspicious, gradually warmed to David's knowledge. Together, they identified oak for the main structure, ash for the shaft, willow for the vanes. Each piece had to be carefully shaped with hand tools, a process that would have taken minutes with power equipment, but here took days. The foundation required similar adaptation. No concrete meant dry stacked stone with careful attention to load distribution. David taught the villagers about keystone arches, transferring weight efficiently. He showed them how to cut stones at angles that locked together naturally. Weeks turned to months. The windmill rose slowly, each component a small miracle of adapted engineering. The hardest part was the gearing system. Without precision metalwork, David had to design wooden gears with wider tolerances, using leather gaskets and animal fat for primitive bearings. The efficiency was terrible by modern standards, but infinitely better than nothing. The villagers' attitude shifted gradually. Initial suspicion gave way to curiosity, then to genuine interest as they saw David's designs take shape. He wasn't just building a machine, he was teaching. The carpenter's son showed aptitude for understanding mechanical principles. The blacksmith began experimenting with new tool designs based on David's sketches. Knowledge spread like ripples in a pond. The day they raised the main structure was a village event. Everyone who could work contributed. David had designed it to be assembled in sections, each light enough for manual lifting but strong when connected. He called out instructions through the elder's grandson, who had become his constant translator and increasingly friend. "Thomas," David had learned his name. "Tell them to brace the eastern support first. The weight distribution is critical." Thomas relayed the message. The villagers moved with growing confidence. They'd learned to trust David's strange knowledge, even if they didn't fully understand it. The vanes were trickier. David had calculated the optimal angle for catching wind, but shaping the wooden slats precisely with hand tools proved nearly impossible. He settled for good enough, knowing he could adjust later. The fabric covering came from donated sailcloth, a precious commodity that represented real faith from the village. As autumn approached, the windmill stood complete, or as complete as medieval engineering allowed. 20 feet tall, 4 vanes catching the persistent western wind. The internal mechanism was crude but functional. Wooden gears transferred power to a vertical shaft, which could be connected to various applications. The first test was grinding grain. David had built a simple millstone attachment, far less efficient than the water mills at the Lord's Manor, but accessible and tax-free. He watched nervously as Thomas engaged the mechanism. Wind filled the vanes. They turned sluggishly at first, then with growing confidence. The gears engaged. The millstone began to rotate. Cheers erupted from the gathered crowd. Women brought grain saved from the harvest. The stones ground slowly but steadily, producing flour without the backbreaking labor of hand grinding or the long journey to the Lord's mill. What happens next will turn this simple machine into something that transforms not just one village, but triggers changes no one could have imagined. The windmill was about to challenge the very foundations of medieval power structures. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Within days, word spread to neighboring villages. People traveled miles to see the wind machine. Some came skeptical, leaving convinced. Others brought offerings, food, tools, goods for trade, hoping David might build one for them. But success bred complications. The Lord who controlled the regional mill sent representatives to investigate. They arrived on horseback, armed and imperious, demanding explanations. Who had authorized this construction? Who was avoiding rightful mill taxes? The elder met them with careful diplomacy, but David could see the underlying tension. In medieval society, controlling food production meant controlling people. The windmill represented not just mechanical innovation, but social disruption. David was summoned to explain himself. He stood before the Lord's men, Thomas translating nervously. The lead representative, a thin man with calculating eyes, interrogated him about origins, methods, intentions. David answered carefully, emphasizing the windmill's benefit to the Lord's lands. Healthier peasants meant better harvests, more taxes overall. "And you could build these elsewhere?" the thin man asked. David nodded. "With proper materials and workers, yes." The representatives conferred. David caught enough to understand the debate: destroy the windmill and maintain monopoly, or harness this innovation for the Lord's benefit. Greed won over tradition. They departed with warnings about proper taxation, but without ordering destruction. The village celebrated that night. David found himself at the center of it, uncomfortable with the attention, but moved by the acceptance. The elder's daughter brought him ale. The carpenter slapped his back. Children who had fled from him in fear now tugged at his strange clothes, begging for stories. But David's mind was already moving beyond the simple grain mill. Wind power could do so much more. Water pumping was the obvious next step: irrigation for fields, fresh water lifted to homes. He sketched designs for a pump system, teaching Thomas and the carpenter's son the principles of mechanical advantage. Winter arrived with bitter cold that made David long for central heating, but the windmill kept turning, grinding grain even when the water mills froze. The village had food security they'd never known. David modified the design to include a clutch system, allowing them to disengage the millstone during dangerous winds. He also began experimenting with other applications. A simple lathe powered by the windmill allowed for more precise woodworking. A bellows system for the blacksmith's forge made metalworking more efficient, each innovation built on the last, creating a cascade of improvements. The social changes were equally dramatic. Young people who might have left for cities stayed to learn new skills. The village's reputation as a center of innovation attracted traders, bringing goods and ideas from distant places. The elder formally adopted David into his household, providing legitimacy and protection. Spring brought new challenges. Other lords, seeing the disruption to traditional power structures, pressured David's protector to share or suppress the knowledge. A delegation arrived from the bishop, concerned about possible heretical implications of harnessing God's wind for man's purposes. David navigated carefully, framing the windmill as working with divine providence rather than against it. The technical challenges evolved too. The wooden gears wore down faster than anticipated. David experimented with different wood treatments, eventually developing a resin coating that extended their life. The vane design needed constant adjustment for seasonal wind patterns. Each problem became a teaching opportunity, spreading mechanical knowledge through hands-on learning. By the second harvest, 3 more windmills dotted the landscape. David had trained a team of builders, creating medieval engineers who understood not just how to copy his design, but the principles behind it. They made improvements he hadn't considered, adapting to local conditions and needs. The economic impact rippled outward. Villages with windmills could process grain more efficiently, freeing labor for other pursuits. Crafts flourished, trade increased. The traditional feudal structure, based on controlling scarce resources, began to crack under the pressure of distributed production. Not everyone celebrated these changes. The Lord's mill operators saw their monopoly evaporate. Traditional craftsmen resented mechanical competition. Some clergy preached against the hubris of mankind, attempting to harness elemental forces. David received threats, finding dead animals at his door and symbolic warnings carved into wood. The crisis came during a summer tournament. Lords from across the region gathered, and with them came political pressure. David was summoned to demonstrate his innovations before the assembled nobility. It was framed as an honor, but he recognized the danger. Too much success could be as fatal as failure. He prepared carefully. The windmill demonstration would be impressive but not threatening. He emphasized benefits to noble landholders, increased productivity, healthier workers, competitive advantages over neighboring domains. He downplayed the democratizing effects, the way mechanical power shifted influence from those who controlled resources to those who understood principles. The demonstration went flawlessly. The windmill ground grain, pumped water, powered tools. Several lords expressed interest in commissioning similar constructions. But David noticed the careful watchers, the whispered conferences, the calculating looks that suggested political maneuvering beyond his understanding. That night, Thomas warned him. They speak of controlling you. Some say marriage to bind you to a house. Others suggest harder methods. David had feared this moment would come. His knowledge was too valuable to remain free, but he'd prepared. Over months, he'd documented everything. Principles, designs, construction methods, multiple copies hidden with trusted allies. The knowledge couldn't be contained by controlling one man. He made a choice that would echo through generations. At dawn, before the lords departed, David announced he would freely teach windmill construction to any who wished to learn. No fees, no exclusivity. Knowledge is commonwealth rather than private property. The reaction was explosive. Progressive lords saw opportunity. Conservative ones saw threat. The bishop declared a theological inquiry. The merchant guilds split between those who sensed profit and those who feared change. David stood at the center of the storm, protected temporarily by the chaos of competing interests. In the end, pragmatism won. The advantages of wind power were too obvious to suppress. The knowledge had spread too far to control. The best that traditional powers could do was adapt, finding new ways to maintain influence in a changing world. David's life settled into a new rhythm. He traveled between villages, teaching and refining designs. He married Thomas's sister, a practical woman who managed his increasing correspondence and kept him grounded in daily life. They had children who grew up bilingual in medieval dialect and engineering terminology. The windmills evolved from crude prototypes to sophisticated machines. Metal components, initially rare and precious, became more common as smiths learned specialized techniques. Standardized parts allowed easier maintenance. Design variations emerged for different purposes: heavy grinding, delicate pumping, power transmission for workshops. But David's greatest innovation wasn't mechanical. It was educational. He established what would later be recognized as the first engineering school, teaching not just construction, but theory. Mathematics, physics, material science, all translated into medieval understanding but laying groundwork for accelerated development. Students came from across Europe. Some were noble sons seeking advantage. Others were commoners with mechanical aptitude. All learned the same curriculum, creating a meritocracy of knowledge that subtly undermined traditional hierarchies. The smartest peasant could out-engineer the dullest lord. The school's influence spread through its graduates. They carried standardized measurement systems, technical drawing conventions, quality control methods. Each innovation built on previous work, creating exponential improvement rather than linear progress. David had introduced not just windmills, but the concept of recursive technological advancement. Political ramifications followed inevitably. Regions with widespread windmill adoption prospered. Those that resisted fell behind economically. Wars were fought over access to engineers. Treaties included technology transfer clauses. The windmill became a symbol of progress versus tradition, splitting society along new lines. David aged in this transformed world. His hair, once corporate short, grew long and gray. His hands, soft from office work, became gnarled from decades of manual construction. But his mind remained sharp, constantly solving new problems, adapting modern knowledge to medieval constraints. In quiet moments, he wondered about the timeline he'd altered. Would the Renaissance come early? Would the Industrial Revolution skip steam and jump directly to more sustainable power? He'd never know, but the evidence suggested acceleration. Ideas that had taken centuries to develop in his original history appeared in decades here. His children became engineers and teachers, carrying the work forward. His grandson designed a windmill that could adjust its vane angle automatically, maximizing efficiency across wind conditions. His granddaughter established engineering schools in 3 kingdoms, standardizing education across political boundaries. The ripples spread beyond technology. Mechanical thinking influenced philosophy, encouraging systematic analysis over dogmatic acceptance. Art incorporated engineering aesthetics, precise proportions, mechanical harmony. Music experimented with wind-powered instruments. Literature explored themes of human agency versus natural force. On his 70th birthday, David stood atop the original hill, now crowned with a monument windmill, larger and more sophisticated than his first creation, but recognizably descended from it. The village below had grown into a town, prosperous from its position at the center of innovation. Windmills dotted the landscape as far as he could see, their synchronized, turning a mechanical ballet. Thomas, old now himself, stood beside him. "Do you regret it?" he asked, "coming here?" David considered the question. He'd lost his world, family, friends, the comfortable life of a 21st century engineer, but he'd gained something perhaps more valuable, the chance to nudge humanity forward, to compress centuries of development into decades, every windmill turning, every student learning, every innovation building on the last. It all stemmed from that terrifying moment waking in a medieval barn. "No," he said finally, "no regrets." As the sun set, painting the turning vanes gold, David reflected on the strange journey. He'd been a mechanical engineer in Boston, designing turbines for wind farms. Now he was a legend in living flesh, the windmaster who brought power from air. The technology was cruder, the implementation slower, but the impact was perhaps greater for its earliness. His final years were spent documenting advanced concepts his students weren't quite ready for: electrical generation, advanced metallurgy, precision manufacturing, seeds planted for future generations to nurture. He established a library dedicated to preserving and expanding technical knowledge, safeguarded against the losses that had plagued historical progress. David died peacefully at 75, surrounded by students and family. His funeral drew thousands, engineers and farmers, nobles and commoners, all united in recognizing how one man's knowledge had transformed their world. They buried him on the Windmill Hill, facing west into the winds that had powered a revolution. The gravestone bore a simple inscription in Latin and the vernacular. He caught the wind and gave it purpose. But his true monument stood across the landscape, hundreds of windmills turning, thousands of minds thinking mechanically, millions of lives improved by distributed power and democratic knowledge. History would remember him as the Windmaster, the mysterious stranger who appeared with impossible knowledge. Legends grew around his origins: divine messenger, traveler from distant lands, survivor of Atlantis. The truth, time traveler from 21st century Boston, was too strange for even the wildest tales. But David's legacy transcended origin stories. He'd proven that knowledge, freely shared, could reshape society. That mechanical power could democratize opportunity. That one person in the right place, with the right skills, could accelerate human progress by centuries. The windmills kept turning, grinding grain, pumping water, powering innovation. Each revolution carried forward his essential insight. The technology wasn't just about machines, but about expanding human capability. In transforming wind into work, he'd transformed work into freedom, subsistence into prosperity, tradition into progress. From that first terrifying awakening to his final peaceful breath, David had lived between worlds, carrying future knowledge into past constraints, creating a new timeline that was neither purely medieval nor modern, but something unique. He'd been given an impossible situation and had responded the only way an engineer could, by solving problems, teaching others, and building something that would outlast him. The wind never stopped blowing. The windmills never stopped turning. And somewhere in the mechanical harmony of wooden gears and fabric veins, David's spirit lived on, not in mystical terms but in practical reality. Every problem solved, every innovation shared, every life improved. The mechanical engineer who woke in the past and built the future, one windmill at a time. That was incredible. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and click on the video on your screen right now for another amazing tale that will blow your mind.